Hey, this is Stuchiu, and today I wanted to talk about a concept about shells and cores in esports games. And this topic was sparked by a video Thorn did a few months ago. I think it was in 2018 about cores in CS:GO and like the elusive nature of them. Because the way people were defining cores back then was basically whatever leftover players were still in the same team. So the example he brought up was SK when they removed Taco, and then everybody started calling the remaining three players the core of the SK squad for Fallen Coldzera. And he pointed out that that particular definition didn't make sense because the core play style of that team fundamentally changed once they removed Taco from the puzzle, right? And so it wasn't really fair to call it the same core of players because their fundamental playstyle is different, and therefore their fundamental identity is different. So the core itself was no longer intact, so to say. And I've been ruminating about this particular topic for a few months because it's fairly complicated, especially if you're not just focused in on a single game like CSGO, but if you're trying to broaden this model towards other particular esports games. And after thinking about it for a while, like, it works. There are fundamental truths to its application. If you're talking about Overwatch, you're talking about Dota2, and probably League of Legends, but I don't really watch enough League of Legends to give a very strong opinion about that particular game. So I'm just going to skip it. But if anybody wants to go into it, they can. So when I was thinking about those particular games, Overwatch and Dota 2, I actually found I had to use a very different concept in order to help model how team cores worked through players. And the model I used was actually from a fighting game, Marvel vs. Capcom. And in that particular game, it's actually a 1v1 game. But what makes it applicable to these team games is basically each player has to choose three characters, and then they form like a team of fighters, and then they go and fight each other, right? And basically in Marvel vs. Capcom, everybody eventually found out like there were specific combinations of characters that were stronger than the others. And in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, like the two best they called them shells basically, and the two best shells in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 were Dr. Doom and Morgan, or Dr. Doom and Virgil. And the way these worked out was like they gave a very specific type of base play style, and then you can plug and play the third character in. And even though like the strength of the composition would rise or fall depending on what your third character was, the fundamental baseline, fundamental strategy of your team was the same. So in the Doom Virgil case, basically Doom has this great assist where it just shoots a shit ton of homing rockets at you, and then that lets the player get a chance to open up the other guy. And then with Virgil on anchor, basically the whole point of him having him on anchor is once you build up enough meter, once you lose your other two characters, you can then just X Factor and then kill everything. And so that's always been a reason why Virgil was so popular in that particular game. And then the other shell that's worth mentioning is Doom Morgan, and this is something that basically Chris G created. And this was fundamentally different in that rather than trying to build up all the resources to just go to Virgil and then win the game, what he instead did was play a very heavy control style that was more predicated on spacing, on positioning, because basically with Doom Morgan you can spam a shit ton of fireballs, rockets, and all that shit at somebody, and then using that, basically he can control the entire tempo of the game. And what was genius about that particular composition from Chris G was basically Marvel vs. Capcom is a one touch, one death game. So he basically forced the game into a situation where you could never really touch him. And that's why he's considered like a Marvel god, or like one of them. And the reason I'm bringing up this topic is because it's actually useful if you're trying to analyze particularly heavy hero games like Dota 2 or Overwatch. Like for instance, in Dota 2, there have been a lot of different like combinations of characters throughout time that kind of created like a baseline of what kind of strategy a particular team is running, right? Like one of the more famous ones is recently probably. All right, I'll give a few examples. First one is like Terrorblade and Dazzle, right? Because if you get the Terrorblade and Dazzle together, basically you're just telling the other team we're gonna play like a type of 4 protect 1 style where we put all the resources in Terrorblade, and then he's going to go ham, and then Dazzle's going to be there to like save him. All right. The other one would be like X Skywrath. This was popularized by Liquid in their first, like I think it was Epicenter run, where basically they realized if you had that combination of off lane and support, basically the Axe could blink in, call, Skywrath could ult, and then you have an instant pick on the map. And because you are the one being aggressive in this particular sense, if you draft correctly around the Axe Skywrath combo, you can easily convert that into an objective win or some kind of map control. All right, another one that's pretty well known is the Oracle Huskar, which is basically like a super cheese in Dota 2 terms, where you basically just, have the Oracle ult the Huskar when they're about to die, and then the Huskar just goes ham, and you try to kill them before the game goes late. And then probably the most iconic one, I'd say, is Wisp Gyro, because, just teleport, team fight, farm, all that shit. It's very, basically a Wisp Gyro game is defined by the Wisp Gyro, and like, even though the other picks in the draft are important, and as they enable and help the Wisp Gyro, in the end, it's all about the Wisp Gyro combination, right? And so when you're thinking about Dota 2 as purely in-game, I think shells are a very good way to look at it, because it gives you it immediately tells you what is the baseline strategy of this team, and then what are the like stylistic small adjustments or changes they are adding to the composition. And when you bring that into context with cores, you have to bring that idea and then contrast it with the idea of cores within teams, where you're just comparing the players and their specific player attributes and interdependencies with each other. It becomes a very complicated but very interesting sort of dynamic, because when you look at Dota 2 as a game, I'd say it's very different actually from CSGO. Because in CSGO, for instance, if I was talking about cores, I'd say the general trend I found once I started analyzing cores, CSGO lineups through the model of cores, is that in general, the core was often the leader, the support player, and then the polarizing star of the team. So for instance, I talked about Fallen, Taco, Coldzera. Right now, I'd say the Astralis core is Glaive, Zitnik's Device, right? I'd say the old phase lineup was Kerrigan, Nico, and then that was the kind of the problem with them, was like they didn't really have a true support player. I guess you can throw an Olafmeister, but I'd say it didn't quite work out that way. I'd say like the old phase lineup with Kiyoshima, Aluwan, I'd say that particular core was Kerrigan, Kiyoshima, and Nico, right? And basically that's kind of how a majority of CSGO teams lineups have worked out. Like if you're looking at like the old Mouse lineup, I'd say Chris J, Stico, and Oscar. I think those 3 players were the definition of the old Mouse lineup. So that's kind of how a majority of the CSGO lineups I've seen, that's kind of how the cores have worked out. Whereas in Dota 2, it's a bit more complicated, not only because they are way more liable to do roster changes, at least in the history of the game, but also because the fundamental game is changing far more rapidly than CSGO, because new heroes are being introduced, new items, and new patches all the time, right? And so I think this is why when we're looking at cores, basically it gives away the fact that leaders are the most important role in Dota 2. And when we look at specific lineups and teams over a long period of time, it's always clear like the core strategy, core identity of the team almost always sticks with the in-game leader. So talking about like Xiao 8, great example. Basically, he can play with any fucking team, but his specific style always came through regardless of whatever 4 players were with him. Puppy is another great example. Like when Puppy left Na'Vi, technically Na'Vi had way more players than the Secret lineup did, but I'd say the Secret lineup played way better like Na'Vi style, I guess, Dota 2 than that Na'Vi team did, even though they had more of the players. Right? When you look at OG, OG is an interesting one because I don't actually. All right, here's. It's complicated basically because we don't really have enough information. Basically, the original core of OG I'd say is actually No Tail, Fly, and Seb, the coach, at the time. Because if you look at the Miracle lineup and then you look at the Ana lineup with Fly and No Tail, those 2 iterations, I'd say they actually played a very similar style of Dota, all things considered. Yeah, Miracle was a way better player than Ana, but Ana's like end game is technically as good as, or depending on the hero, arguably better than Miracle's. So they just all in more on Ana when they had Ana in the lineup. And so, but the overall fundamental strategy of the team and how they looked at the game was fundamentally the same. But if you look at post No Tail Fly split up, it's hard to say what exactly has changed because first off, OG only had the TI run and then they haven't done anything since. So they haven't looked particularly good since then. So hopefully we'll get more information now that Ana's back in the lineup. And as for Fly, I don't actually think EG play flat. EG definitely don't play OG style Dota. So I don't actually know how much Fly. It's hard to say whether or not Fly has like a particular style he institutes or whether he's just using whatever pieces he has at the time. All right. But basically, when you look at cores in Dota 2, it's way more complicated. And I actually think the best way to look at it, in my personal view, is the leader, obviously, and then the sacrificial players on the team. Because I think those are the players that are actually creating the baseline of team play for that particular team. So if you're looking at the EG lineups of PPD, I'd say the core of those lineups were PPD, Fear, and Universe. And here's kind of how it worked out. Basically, PPD was leader. He played the 6 role, and then Fear was the sacrificial 1 player. And then Universe, the reason I think Universe was more defining than either of the mid players where you're talking about Ortiz or Sumail is because what made EG spectacular as a team wasn't the fact that they were running it through mid, even though that was technically the reason why they rose up to become the best team or one of the best teams during their time period. I think it was because when push came to shove, when shit went down, they were one of the best team fighting teams and very incredibly decisive, and a lot of that had to do with Universe. So I think that was the core of that particular EG lineup. And then another one I wanted to look at was like the Eternalenvy lineups. And Eternalenvy lineups, when you go through like Speed Gaming and then Cloud9, and then even I'd argue like the first Secret lineup he was with Puppy, I'd say all of those are actually kind of similar in playstyle. And because of that, I'd say the fundamental core was actually Eternalenvy and Paladai. Basically, Eternalenvy fulfilled 2 roles here. He fulfilled the role of the hard carry, so he always gave the team a win condition, and he also fulfilled the role of like an in-game leader, which was important in the first Cloud9 Speed Gaming iterations, and potentially important in the secret iteration too. If you consider the fact that everybody knows or everybody acknowledges the fact that in general, when you go to the end game or late game, the player who makes the most calls at that point is actually the carry player because they have the most resources, so they have the most knowledge of what they should be doing in order to secure the game. And the reason I also think Paladai was technically a core within all those lineups is because he was the super sacrificial player along with Eternalenvy. Obviously, they played together the longest time period, But basically, the way Pilar played, he was very sacrificial. He gained a shit ton of information and he gained a shit ton of space, all of which was critical and defining of all of those different lineups coming together and doing as well as they did. Right? And I want to add in a last thing when you're looking at, or I guess two more things, I guess, when you're looking at Dota 2 cores in general is right now, it's hard to say. Basically, PSG.LGD, they don't think they have a leader, and it's I can kind of see where they're coming from, because basically, as far as I can tell, like FY throughout his entire career, he's always had the problem of being the in-game leader or being a great player. But in this particular lineup, he's a fucking fantastic player. But it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to think he's also the in-game leader in that sense, because he's never been able to do that before, and he himself doesn't even think he's the in-game leader. So it makes me think that this particular PSG.LG lineup, the core of what makes them great might actually be their coach. He's like fulfilling a specific role in that team that some kind of intangible I can't figure out. But it's worth noting that in general, like support duos, and this is why I bring up FY, are also like team defining like aspects. So like FY Fenrir, like the famous super aggressive roaming in your face making plays style of support, particularly on that VG lineup with Hao and Super and Ice. That I think those two players probably were the core of that lineup, and then it's hard for me to say which one was the third. I'd probably say Hao, just because his style of play is pretty unique for a carry. And then, when we're talking about this particular PSG.LGD lineup, I'd say the three players that make up the core of this probably be maybe FY and Xnova. Like, I know it's arguable that Ame is probably their best player, and he does define a lot of their late game stuff. But the problem with that is I always think of PSG.LG as winning in the early game and mid game and early late game. And if you're looking at it that way, I think Xnova, FY, and maybe are the three defining factors of that domination. All right. Now I'm going to go to the next game I want to talk about. Actually, one last thing is another reason Dota 2 is really hard to analyze when you're talking about cores or shells is basically Wings broke everything back in 2016. Basically, their formless style of Dota is considered the most optimal style of way to play Dota right now, technically, like strategically at least. And so majority of teams have at least given nod to Wings in that sense, where like they understand that they have to have a gigantic, like, wide versatile tool set of strategies and play styles and heroes. And so it becomes a lot harder to analyze Dota 2 teams in particular, since basically Wings broke the game. Now onto Overwatch. Overwatch is I'd say arguably is even more patch heavy than Dota 2. Like in Dota 2, there are certain pillars or certain strategies that are evergreen. Like they will always work. Like split push will always work. Objective gaming will technically always work. Very aggressive team fights always work. 4-1s, 1-3-1s, whatever you want to call them, always have a place in Dota 2. In Overwatch, I can't say the same, because if you're looking at the various metas, I've seen like there was dive, there was goats. Currently, there's the bunker meta. Like very, very, very different play styles, very different games. I'd say they're very different games. Basically, like some are closer to a more traditional FPS style. The goats meta is definitely closer to like a MOBA style, without the endless like hero depth of like a Dota 2. And then there's also like quad DPS or triple DPS styles that like Chengdu Hunters run, stuff like that, right? And so I think when you're looking at Overwatch, it becomes a lot more complicated when you're trying to break down what exactly is the core of a team and how does that relate to the shell of the team, because the shells the most majority of Overwatch teams are currently doing is basically just playing to the meta, and I personally think that's a mistake, because they're not playing against Broodlord and Fester, I think. So I'm not gonna go down this rabbit hole. I think it's just too long. It just deserves its own video if I'm going to do it. But basically, when you're thinking about Overwatch, I think first you have to figure out what the meta is, and then you have to figure out what are the shells the particular team is running. So what I mean by shells here is like what are the particular types of strategies they're running, and then from there you can figure out what the exact cores of the teams are, and what the fundamental baseline of team play is coming from. So when I've looked through a bunch of the Overwatch League stuff, I'd say the three biggest, the four biggest roles currently is the coach. Basically the coach is the most important defining factor because, like I said, I think is the most patched game in esports, and because of that, they need to have like a very strong figure that can figure out the game and then figure out a team identity for whatever players they're running, right? Then I think the next three slots are it varies, but generally I'd say main support, or actually I'd say gameplay wise flex support, actually, because I think flex support has been the least targeted position in all the patches. But if I'm going for like team play stuff, I think main support has generally been more important at least for the lower teams. Like if you're basically like shuffling the main support role around, it seems like you generally gain a lot more instability in the general team play, because the main support obviously does a lot of intangible shot calling, but also they're basically the guys who are generally timing the ults or have to like do the counter ults in the team fights or stuff like that. And then the other role I think is main tank in general, and the reason I think it's a main tank is like basically they kind of define the type of the front line, or I guess they define the amount of pressure, the type of pressure you're going to play under. So if you have like a very aggressive, like hyper pressure tank like Fisher or Bumper, then they can end up defining exactly how the rest of your team will play, because it defines the amount of space your team has to execute on a particular strategy. Obviously, this depends on the shells you're running or the meta you're running. And I think that's why that's generally those are the general three rules I'd look at if you're trying to figure out the cores of what makes an Overwatch team. The last one I'd say is potentially flex. It's hard to say. I think it's a bit harder to say just because Diva play is kind of weird, I guess, is the way I put it, because it's so very positional that like it's incredibly positional, but at times there can be like a synergy. Like I said, it really depends on the meta as to whether or not I think the flex tank is part of the core or not. Right. So I think that about covers it for my thoughts about cores and shells and esports, and my general thoughts about how all that kind of combines. All right. See you guys later.